At this stage, it is time to look at the situation so far. What had unfolded since 1933 was the prosecution and the extermination of large parts of all the Jews in Europe. I shall not refer to that as the Holocaust for several reasons. Firstly, the term is not specific. The Holocaust is the name commonly applied in English since the mid-1940s to the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews. However, if we put it this way, it would be literally impossible to speak of Holocaust survivors, because no one can survive death. This is the statistics of the murdered. By country, it scales from 116 persons from Denmark to 2.1 million from the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics and 2.7 million from Poland, adding up to about 6,270,000 individuals by the best estimates. Secondly, the term derives from Greek for a complete burnt sacrificial offering to a god. The philosopher George Agamben has pointed out that nothing in the death of the victims resembled anything like the religious sacrifice of animals or even humans. He stated that those Jews were not exterminated in one insane and gigantic Holocaust, but literally, precisely according to Hitler's announcement, like lice. Nevertheless, it was not unusual to use the term Holocaust for similar events in history as far back as 1189 in England, and it was in fact used in Palestine for the victimhood of Jews in general as early as in the 1930s, when it was discussed in the newspapers before the mass murder even began. I will refer to the events as genocide because this was the term coined by Raphael Lemkin, who tailored the criteria of the crime of genocide to the very measures used again and again to destroy groups of people in part or in whole. He was aware that this had happened before in history to many populations, like the natives of the continents America, Africa, Australia, and Asia during colonization by Christian supremacists. After the war had ended, survivors of persecution and from the concentration and death camps came to Palestine, where they were supposed to become members of the established society along socialist, Zionist ideological lines. For the sake of that, Zionists felt that they had to re-educate them. In the second half of 1945, the immigrant survivors numbered 90,000, in the following 3 years together 60,000. They were not well cared for. Ben-Gurion told his colleagues, "People can live in tents for years. Anyone who does not want to live in a tent shouldn't come here." Later, in the so-called War of Independence, which is identical with the Nakba, 22,000 genocide survivors took part, a third of the whole fighting force. Their share of the 895 victims of the military amounted also to one-third. Within the first year of statehood, nearly 200,000 more survivors came, and by the end of 1949 they totaled close to 350,000, which was almost a third of the Jewish population of Israel. UN SCOP had reported this distribution of the land in Palestine for 1945 and that distribution of population for 1946. The planning of the partition, according to Resolution 181, would have seen this distribution of population for the Arab, respectively the Jewish state. This was a problem in itself because the Zionist state was set up as a republic with a parliament voted for by the population. Therefore, the Zionist leaders' highest regard was towards having a Jewish majority at all times. 55% of the population would not have sufficed for that end. Apart from the longing for a pure Jewish state, this was another reason that made it necessary to rearrange. Ben-Gurion took the challenge upon himself as commander-in-chief, assisted by the 11-person consultant committee. Ben-Gurion targeted for 80 to 90% of mandatory Palestine as territory of Israel. A map was drawn that, according to Ilan Ilan Pappés, anticipated almost to the last dot pre-1967 Israel, which means Palestine without the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Ilan Pappés wrote, "The Zionist leadership was aware of the total collapse of the Palestinian leadership after the Second World War, and of the hesitant position the Arab states as a whole were displaying on the Palestine question. The desperate situation of the indigenous population of Palestine becomes poignantly clear the moment we realize that those who had crushed their liberation movement in the 1930s, the British mandatory authorities, were now the only ones standing between them and a coolly determined and highly motivated Zionist movement that coveted most of their homeland. Zionists were well prepared for the task. Under the leadership of sympathetic British military personnel, they had established several paramilitary organizations dominated by Haganah, the military arm of the Jewish agency, the de facto Zionist government, which planned the ethnic cleansing. During the so-called Arab Revolt, they actively participated in terror attacks of the British army against villages. In addition, a number of Jews had been conscripted in the British army during the ending of the Second World War. To have a basis for planning the actions over the course of years, the village files had been prepared. They were a detailed registry of all Arab villages by the Jewish National Fund, which had been the principal Zionist tool for the colonization of Palestine since 1901, as the custodian on behalf of the Jewish people of the land of Zionists gained possession of in Palestine. By evicting the tenants from land bought from absentee landlords, a growing landless population had been created. The village files included topographic recordings from aerial photographic survey, as well as an amazing amount of details about the inhabitants, quality of land, water strengths, and the history of the place in respect to how to attack it and deal with the inhabitants. That included from the outset the pre-planned murder of participants in the Arab Revolt, and especially those who had killed Jews, but as well those who were supposedly involved in the Palestinian national movement. Villages with about 1,500 inhabitants usually had between 20 and 30 such suspects. A network of local informants was also created. In November 1947, the Zionist military command concluded that the Palestine Arabs had nobody to organize them properly. They judged, if not for the British, they could have quelled the Arab opposition to the UN partition resolution in 1 month. Once the danger of the Nazi invasion into Palestine was removed in 1942, the Zionist leaders became more keenly aware that the sole obstacle that stood in their way of successfully seizing the land was the British presence, not any Palestinian resistance. As the Second World War drew to a close, the Jewish leadership in Palestine embarked on a campaign to push the British out of the country. The British obstacle removed itself as the British government announced that it would terminate the mandate even on May the 15th in 1948, several months before the time envisaged in the United Nations plan, giving actively up on the Palestinians. The Security Council could not take any effective decision after discussing General Assembly Resolution 181 in December 1947. The United Nations Commission on Palestine, established by Resolution 181, could not move to Jerusalem and could only hold consultations in New York. The formation of an armed militia intended to assist the Commission in its functions in Palestine became impractical in the face of the accelerated British withdrawal, scaling down from 100,000 troops immediately after the war. The road to the Zionist state lay wide open. 1946, the 22nd Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, had entrusted Ben-Gurion with the defense portfolio. From then on, he functioned as defense minister and as a prime minister of sorts, as there was not yet a state, and he had total control over all security priority issues of the Jewish community in Palestine. Ben-Gurion had already realized by the end of 1946 that the British were on their way out, and with his minions he began working on a general strategy that could be implemented against the Palestinian population the moment the British were gone. At the time of the start of the ethnic cleansing, Plan C was in place, aimed to prepare the military forces of the Jewish community in Palestine for the offensive campaigns they would be engaged in against rural and urban Palestine. The purpose of such actions would be to deter the Palestinians from attacking Jewish settlements and to retaliate for assaults on Jewish houses, roads and traffic. Plan C spelled out clearly what punitive actions of this kind would entail: killing the Palestinian political leadership, killing Palestinian inciters and their financial supporters, killing Palestinians who acted against Jews, killing senior Palestinian officers and officials in the mandatory system, damaging Palestinian transportation, damaging the sources of Palestinian livelihoods, water wells, mills, etc., attacking nearby Palestinian villages likely to assist in future attacks, attacking Palestinian clubs, coffee houses, meeting places, etc. In February 1947, when the British first announced their intention to leave Palestine, the two communities had seemed closer to a total clash than ever before. Although no significant outbursts of violence were reported before the UN adopted its partition resolution on the 29th of November 1947, anxiety was particularly high in the mixed towns. So long as it was unclear which way the UN would go, life continued more or less as normal. But the moment the die was cast and people learned that the UN had voted overwhelmingly in favor of partitioning Palestine, law and order collapsed. Palestinians were at the mercy of an international organization that appeared ready to ignore all the rules of international mediation, which its own charter endorsed, and was willing to declare a solution that in Palestinian eyes was both illegal and immoral. The UN, as well as the British, as long as they were on the ground, effectively threw them off the cliff. The British avoided any serious intervention as early as October 1947 and stood idly by in the face of attempts by the Jewish forces to control outposts. Nor did they try to stop small-scale infiltration by Arab volunteers. In December, they still had 75,000 troops in Palestine, but these were dedicated solely to safeguard the eviction of the mandatory soldiers, officers and officials. In addition, they even delivered ownership deeds and other vital data to the Zionist leaders to complete their village files. After the 15th of May 1948, there was no excuse for the way the United Nations abandoned the people whose land they had divided and whose welfare and lives they had surrendered to those Jews who, since the late 19th century, wished to uproot them and take their place in the country they deemed as theirs. The expected Arab and Palestinian rejection of the Plan 181 allowed Ben-Gurion and the Zionist leadership to claim that the UN plan was a dead letter the day it was accepted, apart of course from the clauses that recognized the legality of a Jewish state in Palestine. Its borders, given the Palestinian and Arab rejection, said Ben-Gurion, will be determined by force and not by the partition resolution. The partition resolution was adopted at the end of November 1947, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine began in early December with a series of Jewish attacks on unsuspecting Palestinian villages and neighborhoods, in retaliation for the buses and shopping centers that had been vandalized in the Palestinian protests against the United Nations resolution during the first few days after its adoption. To cover their operations with any kind of justification, the Zionists used the kind of narcissistic oversensitivity hostility towards provocations, which is well known ever since. Though sporadic, these early Jewish assaults were severe enough to cause the flight of almost 75,000 people. In the ethnic cleansing operations which followed, the Haganah, the Palmach, and the Irgun were the main forces that actually occupied the villages. Women and children were targeted like the men, who were counted from the age of 10 years. On the 9th of January 1948, units of the 1st All-Arab Volunteer Army entered Palestine and engaged with the Jewish forces in small battles over routes and isolated Jewish settlements, easily winning the upper hand in these skirmishes. The Jewish leadership officially shifted its tactics from acts of retaliation to cleansing operations. Coerced expulsions followed in the middle of February 1948, when Jewish troops succeeded in emptying 5 Palestinian villages in one day. The first targets were the urban centers of Palestine, which had all been occupied by the end of April. About 250,000 Palestinians were uprooted in this phase, which was accompanied by several massacres. Aware of these developments, the Arab League took the decision on the last day of April to intervene militarily, but not until the British mandate had come to an end. February 1948, the American administration had already concluded that the UN partition resolution, far from being a peace plan, was proving a recipe for continued bloodshed and hostility. Therefore, it twice offered alternative schemes to halt the escalation of the conflict: a trusteeship plan for 5 years in February 1948 and a 3-month ceasefire on the 12th of May. The Zionist leadership rejected both peace proposals out of hand. On the 10th of March 1948, Plan D, or Dalet, was adopted by the Zionist leaders, which called for the systematic and total expulsion of the Palestinians from their homeland. The British left on the 15th of May 1948, and the Jewish Agency immediately declared the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine named Israel, officially recognized by the two superpowers of the day, the United States of America and the USSR. On the same day, regular Arab forces entered Palestine. The map of the Arab League seems impressive, but as a matter of fact, there was only one army that could challenge the Zionist forces, the Jordanian. But with the Jordan king Abdullah, the Zionists had already struck a partition deal. He was to get 20% of the British mandate on the west bank of the Jordan River. In May 1948, the Israeli troops could count on the assistance of a small air force and navy, and on the units of tanks, armored cars, and heavy artillery that accompanied them. Facing them were irregular paramilitary Palestinian outfits that numbered no more than 7,000 troops, a fighting force that lacked all structure or hierarchy and was poorly equipped when compared with the Jewish forces. In addition, in February 1948, about 1,000 volunteers had entered from the Arab world, reaching 3,000 over the next few months. Until May 1948, the two sides were poorly equipped. Then, the newly founded Israeli army, with the help of the country's Communist Party Maki, received a large shipment of heavy arms from Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union, while the regular Arab armies brought some heavy weaponry of their own. A few weeks into the war, the Israeli recruitment was so efficient that by the end of the summer, their army stood at 80,000 troops. The Arab regular force never crossed the 50,000 threshold, and in addition had stopped receiving arms from Britain, which was its main arms supplier. Immediately upon the adoption of UN Resolution 181, the Arab leaders officially declared they would dispatch troops to defend Palestine. And yet, not once between the end of November 1947 and May 1948 did Ben-Gurion and the small group of leading Zionist figures around him sense that their future state was in any danger, or that the list of military operations was so overwhelming that they would impinge on their proper expulsion of the Palestinians. In public, the leaders of the Jewish community portrayed doomsday scenarios and warned their audiences of an imminent second Holocaust. In private, however, they never used this discourse. They were fully aware that the Arab war rhetoric was in no way matched by any serious preparations on the ground. They were well informed about the poor equipment of these armies and their lack of battlefield experience and, for that matter, training, and thus knew they had only a limited capability to wage any kind of war. Zionist attacks involved bombardment from the air by planes and from the ground with mortars, the use of flamethrowers, and of biological warfare. Plenty of TNT was used to explode buildings and their inhabitants. In March 1948, the consultancy put out the direct orders to destroy 531 villages and 11 urban neighborhoods and towns, and to expel their inhabitants. By then, 30 villages were already gone. With the list each commander received came a detailed description of the villages in his realm of operation and their imminent fate: occupation, destruction, and expulsion. I will concentrate on one of the operations, the village of Tantura, as described by Ilan Pappés. It happened on the 22nd of May 1948 at night. The offensive came from all four flanks. This was uncommon. The Alexandroni Brigade usually closed in on villages from three flanks, tactically creating an open gate on the fourth flank through which they could drive the people out. Lack of coordination meant that the Jewish troops had fully encircled the village and consequently found themselves with a very large number of villagers on their hands. Tantura's captured villagers were herded at gunpoint down to the beach. The Jewish troops then separated the men from the women and children and expelled the latter to nearby Puraidis, where some of the men joined them a year and a half later. Meanwhile, the hundreds of men collected on the beach were ordered to sit down and await the arrival of an Israeli intelligence officer, Shimshon Mashwitz. Mashwitz went along with a local collaborator, hooded with a sack with cut-out holes for the eyes to hide his face, and picked out individual men between the ages of 10 and 50 and took them out in small groups to a spot further away where they were executed. The men were selected according to a pre-prepared list drawn from Tantura's village files. These were not the only men executed. Before the selection and killing process took place on the coast, the occupying unit had gone on a killing spree inside the houses and in the streets. Most of the killing was done in cold blood on the beach. Some of the victims were first interrogated and asked about a huge cache of weapons that had supposedly been hidden somewhere in the village. As they couldn't tell, there was no such stack of weapons. They were shot dead on the spot. Children watched their father be killed, others up to a dozen of their relatives. When the rampage in the village was over and the executions had come to an end, two Palestinians were ordered to dig mass graves under the supervision of Mordechai Sokoler, who owned the tractors that had been brought in for the gruesome job. In 1999, he said he remembered burying 230 bodies. The exact number was clear in his mind. That happened on the 8th day of the existence of the State of Israel. Ethnic cleansing is not genocide, but it does carry with it atrocious acts of mass killing and butchering. Thousands of Palestinians were killed ruthlessly and savagely by Israeli troops of all backgrounds, ranks, and ages. None of these Israelis was ever tried for war crimes in spite of the overwhelming evidence. Starting in November 1948 and all the way up to the final agreement with Syria and Lebanon in the summer of 1949, the forces completed their mission of cleansing Palestine with increasing levels of ruthlessness and cruelty by occupying another 87 villages. 36 of these were emptied by force, while from the rest a selective number of people were deported. As 1950 began, the energy and purposefulness of the expellers finally began to wane, and those Palestinians who were still living in Palestine by then divided into the State of Israel, a Jordanian West Bank, and an Egyptian Gaza Strip were largely safe from further expulsions. The result of the Nakba was, in figures, 3/4 of all Palestinians expelled, half of their villages and towns destroyed, and only a few ever managed to return. I will return to Tantura because it is mentioned in another book by Tom Segev. In his sensitive account, he commemorated one genocide survivor named Miriam Weinfeld of Polish descent, who endured Auschwitz and the death march to Bergen-Belsen at the age of 17. After having been sent to Sweden for convalescence, she met her later husband Hanan Jakobowicz from Hungary, and they both immigrated legally to Palestine. They went to a kibbutz in the Jordan Valley, where Miriam felt shunned by the young people. She sensed arrogance, sometimes even mockery and hostility. In the older ones, she sensed guilt, even shame, behind kindness. The first baby she gave birth to after her wedding died. They moved to another kibbutz, where she learned to shoot a rifle and did guard duty during the Nakba. When others of their former group from Sweden arrived, they founded kibbutz Nasholim on the coast near Mount Carmel, where an Arab village, Tantura, had previously been. Taken together, the Nakba helped the young state of Israel out of a shortcoming. Tens of thousands of homes were suddenly available, wrote Tom Segev in 1991. It was the Arab miracle. Entire cities and hundreds of villages left empty were repopulated in short order with new immigrants. In April 1949, they numbered 100,000, most of them genocide survivors. One group lost all they had, while the other found everything they needed: tables, chairs, closets, pots, pans, plates, sometimes clothes, family albums, books, radios, and pets. Most of the immigrants broke into the abandoned Arab houses without direction, without order, without permission. For several months, the country was caught up in a frenzy of take what you can, first come, first served. Afterwards, the authorities tried to halt the looting and take control of the allocation of houses, but in general, they came too late. Immigrants also took possession of Arab stores and workshops, and some Arab neighborhoods soon looked like Jewish towns in pre-war Europe, with tailors, shoemakers, dry good merchants, all the traditional Jewish occupations.